Alternative Reality, Volume 1, Chapter 20. Willow opened her eyes only to have them drawn to the elaborately decorated walls around her that formed the large, round, sparsely furnished chamber. As Willow looked up to the chamber's domed ceiling, however, it became quickly obvious why it didn't really need any furnishing to feel full. Above her, the sky was filled with a breathtaking mosaic that left no room for a single thought of something lacking. It depicted a bronze-skinned youth in simple, ragged clothing, hammering at what seemed like the universe itself. With a shining white hammer raised high above head in his right hand, the youth seemed ready to strike order into chaos. Pedro, the god of hard work, migration, and food. Seems like Willow got spawned into one of his points of power, the Chapel of Pedro. Soon enough, a broom-wielding priest approached Willow and gave her a quick once-over, as if to inspect her attire. She wore the same dark green cape, now somewhat blackened and eaten through. Its hood was lowered, only to reveal lovely raven-black hair that hung somewhat untidily, as if she just got out of some scuffle. A quiver with arrows hung over her left shoulder, with a couple of arrows still inside. She wore dark leather from head to toe, decorated with various straps and knickknacks. "Bless thy soul in the name of Pedro. May your hardships bring a plentiful harvest." Without wasting too much time on pleasantries, the priest gave a boisterous greeting as he stared at the ceiling with his free hand lifted in supplication. What a dolt. "Buzz off," Willow shot back and quickly walked past the stunned devotee, the slight furrow in her brow an obvious sign of a sudden worsened mood. Once that was done and over with, she left the chapel, only to exit into a small settlement. Rain poured down its ramshackle wooden block houses, long in need of maintenance by the looks of it. In and out scurried all kinds of folk, most hidden away under bulky hoods, be it to stave off the harsh weather or for other, more nefarious reasons. Unfortunately for them, the settlement was bisected by wide, muddy roads that were so soaked through by the downpour that anyone stupid enough to brave them would have a better chance of passing quicksand. With slight disdain, Willow watched as a group of locals were doing their best to try and get out an idiot that had veered off the safe paths and was now stuck in the muck. When they finally managed to do just that, they had to do it at the sacrifice of the fellow shoes, which were now forever the sole property of the road. At least until the next dry season. She almost scoffed at the sight. To pass this hazardous stretch, planks were laid out as pathways to safely cross that swamp of muck, the wood sinking into it with wet squelches every time someone used them. Willow looked down to her fine leather boots and with a huff decided that the journey wasn't worth the dirt on her boots. So, instead, she turned to look for an inn. It was during that intense search that something entirely different captured her full attention. On the other side of the street, she'd noticed a familiar presence. Wet robes that were stuck to an almost skeletal frame, sunken cheeks, a balding head. None other than the mage, with two shady perps skulking in tow. All three were hunched over heavily from the weight of the large sacks they hauled along. Definitely nothing suspicious at all. Following the mage, Willow glanced over to the second of the three and quickly recognized the warrior that did not even hesitate in cutting her down while she was defenseless. Last in line was a beaten up and somehow crooked looking fellow in worn and torn attire. Another unnecessary addition to the general weirdness of the group. Willow gazed at the group longingly and slowly, almost unconsciously, reached for her waist, only to grab hold of an empty sheath, while the other hand reached up to her shoulder, where once her bow awaited. It did not seem to brighten up her mood at all. Whale, on the other hand, was having his own share of bad moments. "What do you mean you won't buy my stuff?" he shouted at the poor shopkeeper, flailing his arms about dramatically, his face contorted in a vicious mask of anger and disappointment. Funny how a man can look so sad and angry at the same time. "I will not conduct business with scum like you." With arms crossed, head turned to the side in a truly stubborn yet cliché manner, the shopkeeper would just not budge. A short, plump fellow, by the looks of it, in his mid-40s. Beady eyes, a crooked nose, and a sparse beard. He wore a worn doublet with silken pants. Once, that might have been quite an extravagant outfit for a shopkeeper. Those times were long gone now, as torn holes caught the eye here and there. That, and instead of shoes, he wore a pair of slippers. Seems like the two were at it for a moment or two, and Whale seemed to be at his limit. Even his reanimated companion seemed to resonate with its master's mood, and moved around restlessly. A little more, and the undead might just drop that heavy bag of loot it was carrying. Not something to laugh about, surely. Two more were lying barely a few inches away. Apparently, the minion was in charge of guarding them. "Hey, who are you calling scum?" Bob suddenly joined in, obviously offended by the prejudice in the statement. A short, unfriendly glance from the shopkeeper. "Who do you think?" He glared at Whale, slamming both hands onto the counter. "Look, I run a respectable establishment here." A statement that demanded a renewed inspection from both Whale and Bob. Not the reanimated soldier, though, who stood around unsteadily, staring blankly at the floor, growling and mumbling under its burned-off nose. Not someone you'd want to have a pleasant conversation over a cup of tea with. Looked like a good listener, though. Going back to the shop, though, it was small and overcrowded with various junk, cobwebs and dust being the only visible decoration present. This place has definitely seen better times. Rainwater dripped from the low ceiling every now and then, a few droplets magically finding their way towards Whale's scalp, which added to the issue at hand. Simply put, the shop was a dump. After that brief inspection, the two turned their gazes back at the shopkeeper, who so gallantly paused long enough for all of this to pass. He sighed. "As I was saying, I run a semi-respectable establishment here. You don't see me supplying every gutter trash on the streets. It will scare off the customers." Again, the two looked around. Not a single person besides themselves within sight. "Stop doing that!" the shopkeeper finally snapped. "Now get the hell out before I call the guards. I don't want your kind here." He waved his hand with disgust towards the lot. "And take that freak of yours with you. The very sight of him is making my stomach churn." He then added, while pointing at the reanimated minion. Whale slammed his forehead. His signature gesture. and proceeded to conjure a fireball with his right hand. Okay, violence and fire it is, he simply stated, the same way one would say cookies and cream. In compliance with the act, Bob drew his sword, and the reanimated fellow growled a little louder while attempting to unsheath its sword, which resulted in the bag of loot dropping on the floor. Various gear, silverware, and coins spilled from it, which should have caught the attention of the plump owner. Yet it didn't. Whale and Bob froze in place, their reanimated companion attempting to do the same, poorly. Well, what are you waiting for? Get! The plump shopkeeper added after a few moments, completely ignorant of the fortune that was laid right in front of his nose. Whale slowly lowered his arms and released a heavy sigh. Threatening to burn something would be so much more effective. If it was a freaking sunny day, he then said, more to himself than to the shopkeeper, during which rainwater continued to drop from above, a few more drops bombarding Whale's scalp. Bob seemed to already be tired of all this playing around and started pummeling the closest piece of furniture he could find, a rickety old chair. Minion number 1 tried to scoop the loot back into the bag, which proved quite a challenge for twisted limbs. Quite a dedicated fellow, though. Admirable. Hey! What the heck do you think you're doing? Stop that! That was a perfectly fine chair. I could have earned a pretty penny with it. The shopkeeper shouted once again, spouting something only a true businessman would say. While all of this was taking place, a new guest entered the establishment. A soaked-through human woman, her dark green cape turned black from all the water. She looked very familiar and glared at the mage in her usual manner. Oh, come on, Whale moaned in desperation, performing his usual signature movement once again. You'd think that after all that slapping, his forehead would remain permanently red. Before the girl could say anything prepared beforehand, she noticed the comical position everyone was in. What the fuck is going on here? She then said, more surprised than angry. Yet still, the glare was there. Less noticeable, but by now many would most likely be surprised if it wasn't present. A customer, what joy! What would you like, sweet thing? Don't mind these bums and feel free to look around my wares. Suddenly, all brightened up, the plump man waved in an inviting manner. All his attention turned to the girl. Whale sighed once again and waved a hand at his companions. Screw this, let's get out of here. Bob seemed to agree, though he gave the chair one last kick before leaving. Or what remained of it. Minion number 1 was finally able to scoop up all the loot and follow the two while dragging the bag. With bags on their shoulders, the group left, walking past the stunned Willow in sullen silence. Don't mind them, my dear. Please, come in. Take a look. Oh, shut up, Willow finally snapped, forcing the sad little shopkeeper to close his mouth before the slogan was done and over with. She followed the three after that, leaving the shop a sadder place than it was before. And it was quite the sad place to begin with. Once outside, Willow couldn't help but be surprised how fast three losers carrying heavy loads could be. Already, they had managed to cross the muck-ridden street and were about to enter a tavern. The Stuffed Pig. Its name carved out on a wooden board above the dimly lit entrance. a perfect spot for a final showdown, and you could almost see her grin at the sight. Clearly, Willow wanted something from the group, as she soon stomped after them into the same tavern. Whale sat down behind the only free table at the very end of the establishment, with Bob and Minion number 1 in tow. As quiet as dirt the place was, every single person present giving them the weird eye. Or, maybe, Whale was being a bit too self-absorbed, and they were actually ogling their bags of loot. Completely ignorant of the atmosphere, Bob decided to show off and order something, the thick bastard that he was. "Hey, how about some bloody service? Get us some alcohol," he shouted at the nearest waitress, a stout female with arms fit to twist off a neck. Grabbing the request like a drowning woman with a straw, the waitress nodded and quickly scurried off. "I don't drink." Seems like it was Whale's turn to make a tactical mistake, as he decided to inform his colleague at the worst possible time. Too loudly, by the looks of it, because numerous angry swears and grumbling insults filled the air soon after. Like that wasn't enough, the unrelenting female ranger marched into the establishment and went straight towards them without a drop of hesitation. All impulse, this one was. "For fuck's sake," Whale moaned after noticing. This was getting old. Really old. "I wasn't done with you," she shouted, continuing her march in their direction. Another addition to Bob's club for the ignorant. Passing various tables in haste, with unwelcoming stares from each one accompanying the march. Seems like the locals occupied most of them. Stout, rugged individuals with large axes and various everyday tools at arm's reach. "Now is not the best time for that," Well then tried to inform the ranger, using scowls, flinches, and blinks, and every other conceivable means of communication. He even swept his arms about to indicate all the angry stares when he saw it wasn't enough. Instead of stopping Willow, it made a few angry individuals leap to their feet. "What's in the bags, milk drinker?" one of the tougher-looking ones asked. A tall, overly muscled, steroid-stuffed fellow, a red-checkered shirt barely containing his bulky figure, a large axe gripped by his paw-like hand. If one didn't know better, the fellow looked like a lumberjack. Unsurprising, considering what the settlement was constructed out of. Seems like the profession was a popular one. Quite a few tables saw similar-looking individuals occupying them. "Your mom," Bob snarled at the question without hesitation, completely oblivious to the lingering atmosphere of solidarity and the general threatening nature within the establishment. "All three of them," Whale added soon enough, doing a swell job of not making any sense at all, as he stood up a moment later with a fireball already conjured in his right hand. If they were going to do it, then there was no need to hold back. Most likely, too late to retreat either way. Taken aback, the lumberjack froze up in shock, his mouth stuck open mid-sentence. That might have just hit the mark. He probably did have two stepmothers. Finally, seems like the ranger realized what was taking place. A little too late, one might add. She was already standing near Whale's table. Willow gripped her empty scabbard nervously, her glare bolting from one readied weapon to the other. Some drew their knives, though the axe seemed to be the most preferable choice. One of the more notable axe wielders was a half-naked fellow. His head was fully submerged in a bountiful mane of brown hair that was like a crown on a body so muscled that there was a weird sense that he might just explode from the strain there and then. His well-defined lower body was desperately squeezed into leather pants so tightly wound that Whale couldn't help but flinch from second-hand discomfort. None of it mattered before the weapon that fella wielded, though. A huge twin-edged axe with fanged edges and a skull in the middle. Someone had certain insecurities, to be sure. What kind of lumberjack used that kind of axe to chop down trees to begin with? Either way, things did not seem to be going their way. Minion number 1 was already steering, with a broken piece of metal for a sword already readied. Bob didn't fall behind, his chillingly deadly weapon raised high, while the underling flashed a full-toothed grin that spoke of great violence. Whale noted down to take the man to a dentist, since it didn't look like dental hygiene was a thing back in his bandit days. "Hey, give me back my bow and dagger. I'll help," the ranger suddenly said, as she turned to Whale, the glare now all but gone. Only a serious look of determination was present. Guess that was her war face? Whale almost scoffed at that. "Ha, you wish. By the looks of it, you don't really have a choice in the matter either way. Plus, it will take more than favorable circumstances to get free stuff out of me," he replied pompously, only to have a dagger pass right under his nose a moment later, barely missing its mark. Whale then quickly rummaged through his satchel and took out a lovely wooden longbow, beautifully engraved and elegantly bent, as opposed to the inelegantly bent variety one so often hears about. "Here, we'll talk about the dagger once this is done and over with," he said grumpily, and handed over the bow with visible hesitation. "Fine," she replied with a barely visible smirk, and snatched the offered item away before Whale changed his mind. "I'm Willow, by the way," she added, after equipping the bow and readying an arrow. Seems like she was quite satisfied with this victory of hers, though Whale still had his doubts. Trust was overrated. "Original," a sarcastic remark was quickly shot back as Whale raised his eyebrow. "Well, that macho guy over there is Bob," he added while pointing towards the bandit companion. Shooting a glance at the two, Willow very magnanimously held back on the obvious jabs and restrained herself to just a mocking smirk. Whale, however, was too busy berating himself for letting go of such a valuable commodity so easily. Too late did he remember the age-old rule of any self-respecting money grubber. Circumstance determined the price, and clearly Willow valued her gear greatly. Surely he could have used the opportunity to snatch away at least a few gold coins. As another dagger flew by too closely to be comfortable about it, Will was forced to admit that the same probably applied to him, and the desperate circumstance the group were in now. Things were tense, and it looked like the smallest misstep would bring the ire of the whole establishment upon them. Which was probably why the whole tavern held in its breath when the waitress returned, tankards of alcohol in hand. Really, she was either not the sharpest tool in the shed to walk in on such a standoff, or perhaps, Will wondered, as the person who was in charge of alcohol held a form of a diplomatic immunity, or immunity from brawls at the very least. "Ah, great timing," Bob commented, with an unusually cheerful manner. Yet before he could reach out, Whale intervened. "Give me that," which made his companion lift an eyebrow, somewhere under his helm. People were lifting eyebrows all over the place today. "But you said you don't drink," Bob commented with surprise, the corners of his lips twisting down in obvious dissatisfaction when Whale snatched all of the tankards, in his typical greedy nature. Really, there were lines that shouldn't be crossed even in an unequal relationship. not leaving even a sip for good old reliable Bob? That's just despicable. I don't, but they do, Will replied without batting an eye. Not only did he act in an insensitive manner towards his colleague, he did something much worse. Like rubbing salt on an open wound, Will suddenly threw the alcohol at a nearby table, which was surrounded by a pack of angry looking hooded figures. Seems like they were glaring at Will for a while now, mumbling something incomprehensible under their noses. Speaking in tongues, no doubt. How surprised were they when alcohol suddenly splashed on their table and sprayed every which way? Probably not very, since this modest establishment definitely saw its fair share of spilled drinks. It has only seen 2 fires in its lifetime, though. It was about to see the third as Whale threw a fireball at the same place in a blink of an eye. How embarrassing would it have been if the alcohol concentration in said drinks was too low to be set on fire? What a gambler, that Whale. Fire erupted, consuming not only the table, but the hooded figures as well. Those poor roped fellows quickly stood up and started panicking all over the place, flailing their arms about, spreading high-pitched, yet quite musical tones everywhere. All hell broke loose soon after. Bob flipped over their table just as numerous arrows and throwable weapons lodged themselves into it. Willow was already busy counter-sniping their rangers, while Bob and Minion Number 1 charged at the closest incoming melee fighters. It was pure chaos. Fire quickly spread over the alcohol-soaked wood, quickly turning the interior into a grill. Normally, Will would be worried about an imminent fire problem, but it was raining outside, so the settlement should be alright. Though he only cared because he didn't want the whole place to be after his head. With a sigh of relief, the magician eyed the few less aggressive and lethally armed participants rush out of the establishment, while a few more jumped to the fires in a frantic attempt to put them out. Unfortunately, the majority of the patrons were still bent on ripping Whale and his companions from limb to limb. In a rush, Whale threw another fireball at a nearby table and engaged Soul Link with Bob, and proceeded to cast Soul Siphon. Plenty of customers were lined up right in front after all, and Whale was not about to keep them waiting. You have received 142 shared physical damage. You have received 54 shared physical damage. You have received 133 shared physical damage. Bob was already deep in action as he fought against 5 enemies at the same time, with Minion Number 1 in support as he gnawed on a 6th. So unsettling the sight was that at least 3 other opponents stood about hesitantly, a safe distance away with looks of disgust on them. As Bob struggled against unfavorable odds, he suddenly pulled back and wound back his sword as far as he could, and received a number of hits in the process, which almost made Whale smack his forehead again. Yet, soon enough, black flames engulfed the weapon's blade, as Bob swung it at the tenacious enemies. The first 2 fell apart in smoking pieces, 2 more got away with fatal wounds, and the final one got an unexpected present stuck in his side. Those black flames slowly engulfed all 5 victims and consumed them at an uncanny rate. Quite a sight. Bob seemed to be just as surprised as Will was. You have received 225 physical damage. Distracted by that sudden spectacle, Whale failed to notice the projectile that came flying at him with a painful thud. Good thing that he somehow managed to hold on to his concentration, and the attack didn't interrupt his casting. Thick-headed and stubborn to a fault, that Whale. A fraction of a second later, black dust materialized and settled on the bodies of every single person in front, excluding the magician's allies. Whale still couldn't figure out if the spell spared friendlies, or was he just that good at aiming. Either way, a nice flow of health started to resupply Whale and Bob, which offered a much needed helping hand. You have gained a level, minus 200 reputation with the Church of Pedro, doubled due to the effect of Heretic, minus 40 shared reputation. Great. Seems like Whale managed to involve some priest into the conflict. Not his fault, of course. What were they doing in an establishment like this to begin with? Good thing they gave him a nice big chunk of experience. A worthwhile exchange. During that short exchange of activities, Willow's accurate archery skills were already proving quite useful, as most enemy rangers were either disabled or at least distracted. Some simply had their clothes or limbs pinned to the nearest wall. Meanwhile, Bob managed to slice up another victim quite nicely, though 5 more joined the attack against him. One of which just caught on fire when Whale decided to support his friend. "Stop! You'll ruin me!" A loud, croaking voice of the tavern owner echoed through the hall, a request to deaf ears, that was. "Don't worry, dear, we have insurance," a female voice replied back from the same direction soon enough. Must have been the wife. Probably the only person in the whole place that made any sense. Either way, things were looking bad, but under control in a sense. Their party of 4 were holding their ground quite well, even without the help of a bunch of summoned minions. That is, until another force busted into the tavern. A large group of angry-looking locals, pitchforks, torches, and various everyday tools in hand. A genuine angry mob. "There he is! Get the troublemaker before he brings doom upon our homes!" the leading local shouted, pointing his bony overworked finger at none other than Whale. "What the fuck?" he could only say in reply, completely flabbergasted by the turn of events. "Don't you have a little too many enemies?" Exasperated, Willow complained and took out a bunch of arrows from a pouch at her waist. A comical sight, considering the arrows were bigger than the pouch. She placed them in her quiver and quickly enough resumed her barrage of projectiles. She even had the time to throw a few glares in Whale's direction. Talk about multitasking. After that short introduction, the angry locals charged in, stomping over the wounded and knocking down those that got in their way. With a sudden attack from the rear, numerous tavern folk and such turned to face this new menace, engaging the poorly armed plebs, which seemed to be quite effective for a time. Yet with an obvious numeric advantage, the mob simply overwhelmed them one by one, ganging up on a single woodcutter with 10 gaunt, shabby-looking farmers. Domestic abuse. Seeing the approaching mob, Whale quickly assumed the appropriate position and started casting his reanimation spell. Eventually, though not soon enough, blood dripped from his hand and swirling shadows materialized from his position, only to engulf the nearest dead. 10 bodies soon rose up all around, engaging any who stood close enough. After which, quite the pleasant message caught Whale's attention. A spell has reached intermediate level. Vengeful Reanimation, intermediate level 1. Call upon the souls of the tormented, possessing the nearby deceased to bring about vengeance upon the world. Maximum number of minions, 20. Minion strength, 65%. Minion health, 145%. Cost, 300 health. Soul cost, 1 soul per minion. Mana cost per minion, 2 mana per second. Casting speed, 1.6 seconds. Summoned creatures are extremely aggressive and will attack foes on sight. Hard to control. Reanimation will last until mana supply is disturbed or the minions are destroyed. Minion strength depends on the bodies used. Minion strength increased by 15% due to wisdom. Cost reduced by 18.5% due to intellect. Casting time reduced by 18.5% due to intellect. Finally, it seems his continuous use of vengeful reanimation raised its level. Now he'll be able to summon twice as many minions at a lower cost. Their strength rose quite a bit as well. Nothing but good news to be sure. Once that was done, and their forces replenished, Will threw in another cloud of black dust on the newly arrived. You received 3 physical damage, though he received a boot to the head during the process. Seems like there were some rangers among the angry mob. You have gained a level, minus 50 shared reputation. Surprisingly, all this killing gave quite a bit of experience, even though neither Whale nor his colleagues managed to kill a lot. That negative reputation might be a bit of a downside to certain people that ended up on their side by their own volition, to which Whale only grinned sinisterly. Making a habit of this wasn't too far-fetched. "I'm running low on arrows here," Willow grumbled as she charged up a shot, which managed to not only shoot a loudmouth peasant through the eye, but also the one standing behind. Another occasion for Whale to stare with his mouth slightly ajar. Still, he managed to regain his composure in time. Whale began his reply with a glare, which he made sure to give for at least a solid second. Payback was sweet, to be sure. "Nice try, but a dagger-wielding ranger wouldn't help much if things continued this way." He then turned to Bob, who was struggling with the sword a bit. Seems like the blade got stuck between the ribs of a dying lumberjack, the one with an overly large axe. For a moment, Bob seemed to be in trouble as another foe charged at him with a spear. Only seemed to be, since Whale stuffed his face full of fire. Just in case. He didn't want any unforeseen circumstances clogging up his plans. "Hey, Bob, knock down that wall, will ya?" he then added, while pointing a thumb over his shoulder. An obvious plan to create a not-so-secret back exit. Luckily, his colleague got the gist of it, and after finally pulling the sword free, rushed off to work on it. What a dedicated fella. Willow, slightly disappointed due to the failure of her scheme, decided to conserve ammo. After all, fighting angry locals barehanded did not seem like a very fun experience, especially when some of them looked quite dangerous. Mouths dripping white foam, eyes upturned till only the whites were showing. For some reason, they seemed to be in a psychotic trance of pure rage. A terrifying sight, especially for peasants armed with pitchforks and torches. Most likely, those that survive this day will end up as fanatical forward troops in some religious military order. If any survive, that is. The sound of ringing bells drifted in from outside, while the tide of battle started to shift towards the peasantry, as their seemingly endless numbers kept on flooding inside like the sea. Most likely, the whole population decided to join in on the fun, since being a peasant was usually quite boring. Good for them. Not so good for Whale, who seemed angry enough to consider setting the whole damn settlement on fire. Fires raged inside the tavern in full bloom at this point, room becoming sparser and sparser with each passing moment. Not to mention all the smoke that was accumulating above head and steadily coming closer as time went on. Breathing was becoming more difficult. Surely, any sane person would run out, not in. Which the peasantry did not do. About time to get out of this death trap. He turned to look at how Bob was doing, hoping he could vent some frustration by berating the slow progress. Instead, he found that the underling had already hacked out a moderate hole. Will almost clicked his tongue. Damn eager beaver. For a moment, the petty magician glared at the hole, wondering if it was big enough to escape or if maybe he still had time to say something mean. Unfortunately, it was. Big enough, I mean. Big enough to fit a large loot bag through. Or a person. Depends on one's priorities. Good enough, Bob. Let's get out of here. Grab the loot, Weldon shouted, grabbing the nearest bag. Surprisingly, minion number 1 was already slightly ahead of them, as it did its best to rest the bag over its crooked back. While the three wrestled with their own bags, Willow agilely slipped through the hole outside, which didn't upset Whale too much. He didn't expect to get his bow back either way. Notice how he considers the bow his property already? He probably licked it as a ritual of possession or something. As the faltering lines of the reanimated held off the peasantry, one by one the group got out, into the open sky, fresh air, and it stopped raining. Whale took a moment to sigh at the very thought of what was going to happen next. A fire in a tightly clustered settlement of wooden buildings. Another sigh, and then his lips twisted into a crooked smile, while the eyes gave off a satisfied yet angry glitter. Serves them right, Whale mumbled to himself.